Hi, welcome to an introduction on environmental reviews for the Planning, Infrastructure, and Economic Revitalization Program under ReOregon, otherwise known as PIER. Today, we want to talk about environmental reviews, an important and required step for all projects funded with PIER money. We want you to leave with a great understanding of the process as it will be conducted in PIER, as well as a clear understanding of the responsibilities shared by subrecipients, that's you, and OHCS. So, when does the environmental review occur in the PIER process? The review can kick off upon OHCS approval of your project. Please note that the review must occur before you begin any sort of work. We'll talk about why a little later on in this presentation, but remember, completing work ahead of the environmental review will render your project ineligible for funding. So, when is an environmental review required? An environmental review is required when there is what is called a federal nexus. That is, when a federal agency must take an action on a proposed project. Before the federal agency takes an action, the potential environmental impacts resulting from that action must be evaluated under NEPA. Common actions that create a federal nexus include those when federal money is used on a project, federal permits or approvals are required, federal land decisions are required with the project area. So PIER is a federally assisted program which receives Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Money, CDBG-DR, from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. Applications for PIER funding have a federal nexus and must undergo the environmental review process. For PIER, this means that OHCS and its contractors will be preparing the environmental documentation. So, why does NEPA require environmental clearance? When federal dollars are involved, the harms to the environment or humans must be completely avoided or mitigated. So not only do these requirements and processes protect humans and the environment, they reduce the chances of legal actions against federal projects. So really important to understand that no work prior to OHCS environmental determinations or clearance, right? Once a subrecipient or a project partner applies for this funding, the project is considered federalized. That means you must refrain from starting or continuing work, what's known as a stop work order. No project funds, either federal or local, it doesn't matter the source, may be committed until the environmental review is complete. Commitment of funds before the environmental review has cleared is what's known as a choice limiting action, and it will preclude your project from moving forward with PIER. The prohibition on choice limiting actions is incredibly important. No fund commitment can occur without environmental clearance. To commit funds to this work before the environmental clearance will remove your project from the PIER program. So what do we mean by commitment of funds? Commitment of funds includes entering into any contracts, spending money, or any actual work, shovels on the ground, hammers on the wall. So don't put a pen to any contracts, don't pay anyone money, and don't start any kind of work, site prep or otherwise. If you do, again, and I know this is maybe a bit redundant at this point, it's so important, but if you do commit a choice limiting action, PIER money cannot be spent on your project. So with that in mind, very important, right? When in doubt, talk it out. Reach out to OHCS if you are concerned an action could be choice limiting. So let's move forward. Let's talk about some of the different terms and roles and responsibilities to the environmental review process. And then we'll talk about the process itself. You will hear the term RE, or responsible entity, often. HUD refers to the entity that is responsible for conducting and certifying the environmental review as the responsible entity, or RE. So OHCS is the RE on all PIER projects and takes that role very seriously. That being said, the subrecipient, you, also have contractual obligations to abide by the terms of the environmental review process. So what will OHCS do as the RE? With your assistance, ensure no choice-limiting actions occur before the environmental review process is complete. We want your projects to be able to proceed. Determine the appropriate level of environmental review for the project, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. Then complete that appropriate level of environmental review. OHCS will notify the public when applicable. OHCS will request the release of funds for projects that have achieved compliance. And OHCS will maintain the environmental review record, what's known as the ERR. So we've mentioned OHCS is going to be the RE. They'll be conducting the environmental review. But you as the subrecipient have an active role in the review, and you will need to adhere to the results of the review. Subrecipients will provide key project details and ensure that the environmental review is adhered to. Subrecipients will also ensure no funding commitments to work are made before environmental clearance. Now, if any changes to the work cleared in the environmental review are contemplated, a subrecipient also needs to notify OHCS of those changes so that additional clearances can be conducted as needed. So let's talk about the types of environmental reviews you might encounter in PIER. There are 5 levels of review: exempt, categorically excluded, not subject to, also known as sensed; categorically excluded, subject to, also known as CEST; environmental assessments with findings of no significant impact, what are known as EAs and FONSIs; and environmental impact statements, also known as EIS. We will talk about each of these as we move through the review process in the coming slides. So, when the project is approved by OHCS, the agency will review the activities and make an initial determination on the level of review needed for each activity. Once that is done, you will be notified of the level of review. Exempt activities and categorically excluded, not subject to activities are highly unlikely to have an impact on the environment. These include projects like planning, professional services like engineering and environmental services, as well as financial services. As such, these projects can go through an abbreviated process flow to declare the activity either exempt or not subject to the more intense levels of environmental review. Once this has been established, OHCS will notify you that the activity can proceed. If your project involves more physical work, like construction or land acquisition, your activities may need to be reviewed at a higher level. Categorically excluded, subject to, or CEST projects can be used for things like straight replacement activities with no capacity increases. If you want to do a new facility or new construction, you might need an environmental assessment, an EA. Again, this won't be for you to puzzle through. OHCS will review the description and determine the appropriate path forward. After that notification, OHCS will ask for additional project details if needed and proceed with the review process, including outside agency contacts, completing required checklists, and other types of site assessments and documentation. If a finding of no significant impact, a FONSI, is determined, there will be a public notice that OHCS will request the release of funds, followed by a comment period from the public. If all items are resolved, the authority to use grant funds, the AUGF, will be issued, which will allow you to commit funds for the scope of work that was cleared in the environmental review. Now, if your project is determined to have a significant impact, i.e. there's no FONSI or a finding of no significant impact, this does increase the level of review to an environmental impact statement. An EIS is time-consuming, it's costly, and it's likely not able to fit well into the PIER program. So if a project with an EIS level of review is presented to OHCS, it's likely that we'll not be able to proceed. We anticipate that this will be rare or not at all. Now, you may be wondering, how long will this all take? And I know that we are all eager to start work on these very important projects. The timelines of an environmental review can vary greatly, depending on the unique circumstances of your project. So for example, exemptions can be filed relatively quickly. So if you have a planning project, the environmental review is likely going to go relatively fast. Other types of reviews can impact scheduling of your project due to factors outside of OHCS control, like outside agency response time. So looking at a very straightforward project where the subrecipients provided prompt and accurate information and it's relatively simple, we can achieve clearance within 3 months. But if there are special studies or considerations, like say an outside agency takes an interest in the project, the review could take 6 or 7 months or longer, depending on the level of complication. Now, this is largely outside of our control, but we will do everything we can to keep your review moving forward in a timely fashion. Going back to the process, as mentioned in the previous slides, if your project requires assessed, a categorically excluded subject to, or an EA, an environmental assessment level of review, we will need additional information. This includes, but is not limited to, things like specific locations, the address of the project, tos and froms of streets, GPS locations of the installation. We also need performance measures like linear footage, number of improvements installed. We'll need to know the depth and width of ground disturbance, how deep and wide you're going to actually disturb the earth. The method of construction can also be important. For example, if you were installing a new sewer line through what's called pipe bursting, or you take the new pipe and you drag it through the old pipe, versus digging up the old line and laying the new line in that open trench, the impact of the environment is quite different. So the method of construction could be relevant here. We need to know the components of the construction. So for example, if you had a street project, we would need to know all of the components of the street. Is there curb, gutter? Are there ramps, sidewalks? All of that needs to be explicitly listed in the project description. Any acquisition, this is very important. If you have to get an easement or buy land outright, we need to know. And we also need to keep a clear eye on your funding sources and funding amount. So we know that there's PIER money. For example, you had matching funds from your general fund. Maybe those funds go up or down. Maybe there's another federal agency involved, like ARPA. So if there are other sources of funding, we need to know those sources and amounts. Now, after you have provided the required details, OHCS will take that information and then situate your project within a review system. That system is going to look at things like historical properties, floodplain management, wetland protection, coastal zone management, sole source aquifers, endangered species, contamination, wild and scenic rivers, air quality, noise, farmland protection, hazards, environmental justice. Many statutes, right? Many statutes are required to achieve environmental standard. Now, as OHCS and your project move through these processes, there are going to be many documents generated. This document set is known as the Environmental Review Record. We mentioned it earlier, the ERR. And this document set proves that the appropriate steps were taken ahead of the commitment of funds. So some things to keep in mind. The ERR is a public legal document. It may be subpoenaed. And this document set, the ERR, serves as proof of compliance with federal environmental law. And it's also a defense against such challenges to the project based on environmental grounds. So what will be in this review? We've talked about the process and how it's going to generate many documents. This ERR contains the decision-making process and all actions taken during this review. So this is every document, every public notice, every agency communication, and all written determinations or environmental findings. An ERR is required regardless of the level of review. It can be a pretty simple document set for exempt projects, but it's still required. When you move to environmental assessments or environmental impact statements, it can be a very robust set of documents. Again, this ERR is going to describe all the activities in the project. The ERR tells the story, that project description. It's going to have maps, photographs, studies, correspondences, public notices, programmatic agreements, and all of that documentation put together provides a full picture of the project and its environmental impacts. Together, this is going to evaluate the effects of the project on the human environment and the environment itself, and it will document compliance with applicable authorities, record determinations, and contain all that source documentation and relevant base data. Big document set, very important document set, this ERR that OHCS will be creating for your project. Now, it's worth noting that the ERR isn't just a reflection of the process, but it will contain references to your future responsibilities to the environment. These are called mitigation measures, and they're a very important component. These measures are actions that are identified in the ERR process that you'll have to take to avoid or limit the project's impact on the environment. These measures absolutely have to be adhered to. So they'll be in your vendor contracts, your project design, and schedules as appropriate. And you have to maintain evidence that those measures were adhered to. So it's ultimately going to be the subrecipient responsibility to ensure that mitigation measures are included in your project. OHCS will conduct their reporting to HUD based on your reporting to OHCS. So what could these mitigation measures, these actions that your project has to take look like? Some common examples could be things like elevation or floodproofing requirements, scheduling, so scheduling to avoid significant migratory bird nesting seasons, not clearing brush during those seasons. It could be something like a stormwater treatment plan or archaeological monitoring in culturally sensitive areas. It really depends on how intense the impact your project will have. Those mitigations will come into play. It is possible to have projects with no mitigation measures, right? They're relatively simple, relatively straightforward. Most projects will at least have one or two. Now, we have all of that review process documentation. We have our mitigation measures. We're going to have some other stuff in there as well. So we've mentioned about all of those documents that are going to be generated in the process. We're also going to have all of our public involvement and public notices, comments and responses, the written determinations and findings, the request for release of funds, right? If we do determine that there is no significant impact, and the release of the funds issued by the state, what's known as the AUGF, the authority to use grant funds. Very important time in a project's life cycle. Now, we'll do a lot of work. We'll clear the scope of work that's presented, but we do want to acknowledge that change is a fact of life. So for example, if bids for your project come in significantly over budget, you may have to reduce your project scope. Other issues can be discovered in design that require adding additional work to the project. Now, whether it's adding or removing work, no matter what type of change is being contemplated, before you finalize the change, before you move forward with it, before you commit funds, right, an environmental evaluation must occur. So we'll take that ERR and reevaluate it based on these new circumstances. This can be straightforward or it can be complicated. It depends on the type of change. So, for example, if your change increases the scope of work and it increases the level of review, maybe you move from that categorically excluded subject to a full environmental review, right? It can require additional levels of review, right? So those additional reviews can impact scheduling and timelines. So any change to your project really has to be thoughtfully considered, not just for environmental review reasons, for many reasons, but that environmental review will be an important thing to look at and how long that re-review will take. All right, we've covered a lot of ground today, so let's pull back and test our knowledge. So how many levels of review could you encounter in PIER? I'll give you a moment. We have A, 4 levels of review, B, 7 levels of review, C, 5 levels of review, or D, 3 levels of review. If you answered 5, you're correct. There are 5 levels of review, ranging from that fairly simple and straightforward exemption process for certain professional services to a more lengthy and time-consuming process for environmental impact statements. Let's do one more. It's about roles and responsibilities. True or false? Subrecipients will be responsible for conducting the environmental review of each project. Subrecipients will be responsible for conducting the environmental review for each project. If you answered false, you are absolutely correct. While the subrecipients have an important role to play, right? Providing key information, adhering to the clearance, reporting changes, adhering to mitigation measures. Ultimately, they are not responsible for conducting the review. Instead, it's OHCS and OHCS's vendor partners who will formally conduct the review. Environmental review is complicated, right? Getting your hands around it are quite complicated. So there's a wide array of resources available to you. I recommend reviewing the ReOregon CDBG DR page for general info. The PIER program page also has some info specific to PIER. And really taking a good look at Chapter 3 of the subrecipient manual. That is the chapter that is specifically on environmental review, and it's very helpful. All 3 resources are linked in the slide deck. Now, if you still have questions, that's understandable. We're happy to help. You can reach out to PIER at hcs.oregon.gov or directly to Julie Lovren for more information. Thanks again for joining us for this training. We love providing them, and I hope you have a wonderful day.